Hello, welcome to another edition of Let the Quran Speak. Peace be with you and the mercy and blessings of God. I'm Shabir Ali, and I'll be your host for this episode. In this episode of Let the Quran Speak, we'll look at some very important subjects, but we will also be looking at a very special guest and hearing from him, Dr. Tariq Ramadan, visiting from Europe. We'll be speaking about schools of Islamic law and how he's elaborated on this in his book, Radical Reform. And we'll be looking at knowledge of present realities and how Muslim scholars need to be up to speed with all of that, or at least to be in collaboration with scientists of various persuasions in order to get everything connected with each other. And finally, his call for a moratorium on capital punishment. So without further ado, let me turn to my guest, Dr. Ramadan. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
Now, to continue our discussion from our previous show, we were talking about your book, Radical Reform. And you spoke in your book about the various approaches to fiqh or understanding Islam. There is, on the one hand, the inductive manner of Imam Abu Hanifa. There's the deductive manner of deriving the rulings by Imam Shafi'i. How does that inform our present task of looking at how the Islamic law would apply in our circumstances?
I think that we really have to understand how it worked, historically speaking. At the beginning, we had, the companions and the followers, tabi'in, trying to find how to implement the rules in their environment. And they were doing this naturally, from the text to the environment. And then the Shafi'i came and he understood that this is not going to work like this. We need a framework, we need a methodology, we need categorizations of rules, what are the priorities and what are the usul, which is the fundamentals, and what the secondary issues. So he came with something which is building a kind of or constructing a kind of a framework, and this is the way the scholars were doing it naturally. He wanted it to be put in a synthetic way, in a clarifying the different dimensions. So he did this, and then he was traveling, and he was also in touch with the students of Abu Hanifa, who was before him. And Abu Hanifa didn't went through this process. He was doing it naturally with his students. And then they also did, okay, we need this, but what we are going to do is to do it inductively, to come back from the answers that Abu Hanifa gave to the principles that we can extract from the text. So we have two methodologies doing what, in fact? Giving us, the rules of extracting the rules from the text. So in which way? How do we read the scriptural sources? And this is, this discussion of methodologies was something which was natural from the beginning. If you look at the Sunni tradition, we had between 16 to 18 schools of law during the first 2 centuries. So meaning the people who were thinking about methodology, and they were discussing this. And with the Shia tradition, we have a scholar who is in between the two dimensions, Ja'far al-Sadiq. So these are, schools where this discussion were there. So the point for me was not in the book to speak about this diversity of schools, which is a fact, a historical fact, but to come back to the usul, which is what are the sources that we have to rely on in order to understand in which way we have all these schools of
Usually when the average Muslim thinks of the Islamic law, the way it has been taught to the average Muslim is this is the law, that's how it is in every issue. And the average Muslim comes to think of the law as being something fixed. But then, of course, we come into situations when there is either a haja or a need, or even stronger, a darura, a necessity, based on which the Muslim scholars may say, okay, we can relax that a little bit. You have a rukhsa or a permission to forego that particular stringent requirement. And here the scholar is obviously relying on some usuls or basic principles that allows the scholar to switch from that particular law to a different particular law for this new situation. But you seem to be saying that we can even go back to the usuls or the principles and look at them again, whereas most of these scholars would say, no, the usuls themselves are now given realities. We can. So for the average Muslim, the final law is the given reality. And for the average scholar, it seems that the usul or the principle is the given reality. But if Imam Shafi and Imam Abu Hanifa and so on were deriving usuls or principles as they go, it seems that you're saying that this can be done even today.
Of course, I think that today the reality that we are facing is pushing us to come back to this and to understand that what we are talking about, what the deductive process, the inductive process, or even a Shatibi following Al-Jawini and Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali, they were coming with, okay, now we need to understand the objectives, the whole text is not much more, we need more than the framework, we need to understand the ends and the goals. So Madrasat al-Maqasid, that is so important that we are coming back to now. All this is human construction. It's coming from minds trying to understand in which way you understand the text. My point is
but this is where it gets difficult for the average Muslim to think about. If we talk about the goals and so on, aren't we trying here in a way to read the mind of God, and can we really do that?
No, all the scholars were doing it. When you have a hukmah, you also try to understand the illah, which is the intention. Why this was coming. Why, for example, we don't drink alcohol. So there is, of course, for you to understand what is in Allah's intention. He is telling us things for us to achieve because He wants something from us. So this process was always there for all the scholars. You cannot read the Quran without trying, when it comes to rulings, to try to understand the objectives, what God is expecting from us. So you have to do this with limits. There are some things that you cannot just understand. And this is why Ali karramallahu wajhah was saying, you know, not everything in Islam is about rationality. If not, al-masah would be under your feet and not up your feet. So why? Because the rationality would be the reasonable thing would be this. So we have to understand that we have limits with our rationality, but we also have to understand that we are building something because there is no texts without intellect to read it. So this is something which is quite important. Now, I'm not at all denying the fact that we have usuls and principles that are immutable. When it comes to aqidah, the creed, when it comes to al-ibadat, the practical, our practice, our worship, and when it comes to some of the principles that we cannot drink alcohol, that the pork and even the hijab and all this, the khimar, all these are principles that are immutable. But there are many, and this is the majority, and this is why we have so many schools of law from the very beginning. Many things are open for interpretation. So we need to come to the source to ask ourselves, how are you going to promote an Islamic ethics in our world if you don't know how this world is working, how his work is evolving? And this is the main question.
Okay, so we'll try to come back and find out to what extent we can look at new situations and how to understand these new situations by looking right after the break at the realities of our present situation and how Muslim scholars need to come to grips with those realities.